Gaming culture allows a broad variety of storylines that we haven't seen before. Hollywood is discovering this trove of IP, this intellectual property. It indicates to me sort of the lack of innovation in the Hollywood side. You see a revitalization of game sales because the TV series just reminds people of their favorite franchise. Instead of making games and making movies, what we're really doing is making audiences.
Especially in the recent years, why is Hollywood now so obsessed with adapting games into movies?
We've just been beaten to death with all these superhero movies. People are totally tired of, grown men with capes and their underwear on the outside, and they're just ready for something else. And gaming or gaming culture allows a broad variety of storylines that we haven't seen before. And so Hollywood is discovering this trove of IP, this intellectual property that they haven't been able to leverage in the past, and that now becomes incredibly valuable.
Right. So the previous understanding, or my understanding, was that you had a movie that kind of became the center of an IP universe, right? You would have the Clueless movie come out, for example, and then you had games that came out around it, whether they were computer games or, card games or something like that, or merch that went around it. Now it seems like anything's fair game. If there's a fan base around it, that could become the center of the IP universe, and then you could make a movie out of it. So is this a trend that we're seeing, and where did it start? Because I'm also thinking of Pirates of the Caribbean. That's a ride in Disney World in the US, and then it became a whole movie franchise, for example.
I like that question. So yes, it used to be sort of an additional form of revenue where it's we have this thing, let's just sell off the rights and somebody's going to make a crappy movie and then maybe make a couple of bucks. And that was if you look at the economics up until 2010, that was a great way to end your career as a film director, because there is just a string of non-profitable movies. I mean, it was terrible. It's even franchises that worked well, they end up underwater. By 2010, the franchise become more valuable, and the audience drives more. Comes out in droves, and they start spending more. All of a sudden, it starts to turn around, and then it becomes a viable form of entertainment. The only exception here is the Pokemon movies. They now have, I think, 23 full feature films, each 90 minutes long, that always break even and make a profit. But that's sort of uniquely Japanese. That's their thing. On a global scale, it's turned around, and so in many ways, the film industry and the games industry have found each other, but rather than having accretive revenue or additional money coming in through these franchises and merch events, now it's part of this flywheel, right? The games industry has grown. It's become incredibly large and also cluttered. And so it's a great way to stand out. If I'm not playing the game, then maybe I can go watch the game, or I can go online and discuss the game with other people. But so there's all these other activities surrounding it. And film is taking a very notable piece of this. You mentioned HBO. You see a revitalization of game sales because the TV series just reminds people of their favorite franchise, whether that's The Last of Us, whether that's Fallout. So it becomes part of a flywheel rather than just sort of a little bit extra money on the tail end.
Casting your mind back to the past, Joost, why did games, movies historically fail compared to how successful they are today?
Yeah. So the history of the games industry at the box office is terrible. You end up with a lot of people losing money, and so it just has always been this venture where people go okay, don't do this. You're gonna lose all your cash. The reason was because they didn't know very well. So famously, I mentioned the 1983 adaptation of the Super Mario Brothers with Dennis Hopper. Allegedly, Dennis Hopper, as famous as he was, never even looked at the script or the IP or really bothered to know who Bowser was, the bad guy, the arch nemesis of Super Mario. And so you get a creative industry that is totally disconnected from the actual text, from the actual cultural of the games industry. And so as a result, they just make movies. Movies.
I'm wondering, I'm of two minds of this, right? One part of me is Hollywood's just milking this nostalgia machine. They're doing the same thing that these reboots are doing right now, the reboot of Harry Potter, for example, or the Barbie movie, right? Just milking this idea that people grew up with and trying to turn it into profit now. But then the other part of me is looking at, for example, The Last of Us. Maybe that was a story that a few years ago the gaming industry was just willing to tell, and Hollywood wasn't willing to tell it. And now that Hollywood can see, oh, okay, actually people do like this game, and like the queer characters, for example, that are centered there, they're like, ah, okay, now that somebody else is taking the risk, we're ready to take the risk, less of a risk now. So how do you see it?
That's a good point, right? So in general terms, I've always looked at it as to say that the games industry is, in the stories that it tells, is able to go beyond sort of like the classic Disney narratives.
Yeah.
You know, like every move, like it's only recently that we stopped rescuing princesses. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and so I am all the way up on all of the Frozen lore, but that's a very relatively new development in sort of traditional Hollywood cinema, whether that's animation for children or otherwise. The games industry offers a much wider range of narratives and storylines, and it's because it borrows on animation, it borrows from the comic book industry, and so it's just a different set of storylines that now suddenly become relevant in the case of The Last of Us, for instance, or having a different set of values and representations in gaming. I think that is precisely why Hollywood has embraced it, because it allows them to tell those stories, but still sort of borrow the fact that, well, it's gaming, so it's sort of like this other space, and we can borrow stories from that. We can have different, heroes that lead the narrative, as opposed to that we must stay true to somebody wearing a dress and a ball gown to save the day. Right? It can be something more gritty. It can be something that tells a story that we haven't heard before. And I would add to that the games industry, unlike, say, the storytelling that you see in Hollywood, tends to be much more global, tends to cater to a global audience. And so there is much more influence from, say, Japan, right? And Japan, if you've ever watched any anime, that is an experience all of its own, right? I mean, it's just aesthetically different. It is storytelling-wise, it's very different. But you see the narratives kind of progress. And so the way to button this, for instance, is to say, a phenomenon like the Hunger Games, right, which is the series of books, it's been made into movies, that has also been popularized by games like Fortnite, where you sort of have last person standing wins. But that's something that comes from the manga culture from Japan. And so you can draw this red line from, all the way to Japan in every Western audience, saying like, this is an idea, it's a concept, it's a way of storytelling that would have never emerged from the West, but it comes from the East, and now through gaming, it travels much further, and it becomes all of its own a narrative economy. And so whether it's game mechanical, whether it's like, a world building conversation, whether it's certain queer characters, I think all of that borrows from the games industry. And I think that it has given Hollywood a bit of a pass on taking itself too serious and try out something different as audiences change their habits.
As a professor who's dealing with this on a professional level, researching games, and also as a fan and maybe a gamer too, what do you think is the tricky part about, getting a game adapted into a movie the right way?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So here's a recent example. One famous YouTuber, Markiplier, recently self-funded and released across 4,000 screens in the US a movie called Iron Lung, which is an adaptation of a game by the same name. So Markiplier is one of these people that plays video games on the internet, and he had this sort of epiphany as he played the game 3 years ago and then started slowly moving towards his self-produced thing. It indicates to me sort of the lack of innovation in the Hollywood side. It's like Hollywood is a great place and everybody does a good job, and also it's incredibly slow moving. Right. So it's been historically very difficult to synchronize the release of a video game title, with the release of a box office film. And so because they have these, it's basically just two giant tankers sort of somewhere in the ocean, as opposed to like a speedboat. And so I think the disruption comes from the fact that we now have the ability to have, say, influencer-led or smaller scale projects seeing the light of day, because there's already a baked-in audience, which is sort of I think the takeaway from all this is like, instead of making games and making movies, what we're really doing is making audiences. Even Minecraft, the movie, you could argue, this is my students talking, they did not think that was a great movie, and yet every single one of them went and paid money to see it. So it's a bit like, I'm sure there's going to be a second one, but it's sort of a baked-in thing that people do. I think that there's trying to give people a little bit of autonomy in experiencing is the way to do it. And yeah, there is a risk involved, but historically, or based on the data, it's like that seems to be the way to really get it to the mainstream, massive blockbuster hit.
Hollywood is getting movies out of this or TV series out of this, but what is the gaming industry getting out of this?
That's a good one. So the games industry benefits from this in many ways. One of them is, of course, just visibility, and it makes whatever the IP more grand, and everybody gets it, and it's all very famous. Just because I'm in this industry, that doesn't mean I'm not cynical of it. The thing that the games industry tends to do is borrow from the film business for its self-esteem. It's like as if we don't matter as a $250 billion industry unless somebody makes a movie out of it. It's like, the games industry doesn't really have red carpet events. We don't have Oscars or Emmys. We have some BAFTA awards, and that's kind of cool, but it's not, it's not recognized by the same self-congratulatory ceremonies that you see everywhere else. And that's probably fine. That's sort of the nature of the business. And so for the longest time, they would hang their own self-esteem up on the recognition and adaptations from other businesses, other creative industries. But it really comes down to, of course, it's a money play. But it's when you look at a Fallout, for instance, like this series comes out and immediately people are reminded how much they love the game. So they start playing it again. New fans come into it. And so you see the revenue spike for Microsoft in the weeks that followed. The first 4 weeks after the series first season came out, they made like an extra $150 million. Just found money,
pocket change,
just sales coming through all the different. Just pocket. Look, if you're making $25 billion a year, it's fine. It's nice, but that's money they didn't have, and so then they get smart and they say we should do more of this, right? And the same applies to smaller titles. So, like CD Projekt had a miserable release with Cyberpunk 2077 during the pandemic. Very, very famous case of like, it was like this big, high and mighty thing. Anyway, a terrible launch usually means the end of a studio. The way that they recovered, among other things, is by having a Netflix adaptation. And what it allows people to do is like familiarize themselves with the story, with the characters, with the IP, whatever, without knowing that the game initially was terrible. And so by the time they then become aware of it, they can start playing it. The game has been fixed and patched up. And so it gives them another chance at success, in other words.
We've spoken a lot about the US, and you also alluded to this pipeline of manga to games to US movies. Are we seeing any games turned into movies in other countries outside of the US as well?
Yes. So Japan is huge on this, obviously. And if you look particularly at Sony, which owns like 70-80% of like the anime business there and relies a large part on overseas sales, you start to see them make adaptations. So Ghost of Tsushima is one of those. Like it was a new IP for the PlayStation ecosystem. You're this 13th century samurai that goes rogue and tries to save the world or whatever. But it's this beautiful epic story, and they've made that into an animation, right? And so that's going to be, I think, coming out next year or whatever. But the idea is that they now start to see it more broadly as like part of the flywheel. Yeah. And so Japan is big on this. I suspect there's going to be more coming from Korea. China has had a lot of success with like Black Myth Wukong, for instance. So, you can sort of set the clock to the fact that they're going to make a bunch of movies around that kind of mythology as well. Because, it's basically a culture telling the same story that they've always said, but in new ways. And they want to distribute them as widely as possible. Europe is the same in that sense, is where you have a large part of, say, France, rallying behind some of the stories, the tropes that come from there. Okay, how do you expand that, right? And so, did everything work out well? No, of course not. The Assassin's Creed adaptation was not well received, to put it nicely. And so there is the ambition. It doesn't always work out, but you start to see countries that are very proud about their own storytelling, leveraging games as sort of this global platform, and then manifesting also in film and TV adaptations to kind of get the story to a broader audience.
That's just a sneak preview of our podcast, The Dip.
If you want the full episode or subscribe to our podcast, you can scan the QR code that's now appearing somewhere on your screen.
You'll find it. But we'll be back same time, same place. But until then, thank you for checking out The Dip.